everybody. The topic for this module is preventing sexual violence. And I want to give you some thoughts about how we might go about actually preventing sexual violence from happening in the first place, and give you a brief overview of some of the research that's been done, some by me, much by other people. And first is a bit on language. For a very long time, people, when they talked about preventing sexual violence, they talked about educating women about self-defense, don't wear a short skirt, don't go to a party unless you're with 10 of your friends who are all armed. I'm being facetious, but that approach isn't going to be very effective at preventing violence against women, because you're relying on the person who is receiving that violence to somehow control the actions of another person. And so that paradigm began to be questioned roughly 20 years ago, where we started talking a bit more about prevention, talking to men, because men are doing, depending upon the study you're reading, roughly 95 to 98% of the gender-based violence, particularly sexual violence. So if perhaps we go to the source, that could be prevention. And then when we talk to women, that can then be called risk reduction, because there are some things that women can do that will lower their risk for sexual violence, but still, just about anybody can be a survivor of sexual violence. And from a prevention standpoint, it makes sense to go to the source. Now, there are some even newer thoughts about prevention out there, that we can have prevention approaches where both men and women can help to prevent the sexual violence of others through things like bystander intervention and those sorts of things. And I think it's a perspective that's worth very serious thought and consideration. So anyway, that's a little bit on language. One of the theories that I've applied to my work, and hope that others will do so, actually comes out of social psychology. And the theory is called belief system theory. And I have you read an article about that for this week. But essentially, here's what that theory states. If you want to change someone's attitudes or behaviors on any particular topic, you have to do so in a way that targets their existing self-concept, their existing self-conceptions, in order to be lasting. So, for example, everyone has their own self-concept of who am I, what's important to me, what do I value. And if you want to change someone's attitudes about something, you can't approach them in a way that conflicts with their current self-concept. So, for example, let's say we were doing a intervention based on alcohol reduction, and we were talking to a group of freshmen in college or first-year students in college, and we said, well, we all know that you're going to drink because we think you're all alcoholics, and now we're going to teach you why you shouldn't drink. Well, that'll work. Not really. Because it doesn't meet with the self-concept of almost all people in the room. Almost all college first-year students, they don't think of themselves as alcoholics, and in fact, they're not all alcoholics. Some of them are, but not all. But even if you approach the alcoholics and say, we're going to teach you why you shouldn't drink, that's not going to work. So what belief system theory does is it allows us to design different interventions where we can meet people's existing self-conceptions with the hope of change. So one of the things we know about college men is that their self-concept tends to include, I can be helpful to others, and if I see something that's not right, I can do something about it. So a lot of the work that I've done tends to rely on those self-concepts. So we want to approach men from, you're capable of helping another individual, you're capable of stopping something bad before it starts. And so in the intervention work that I do with men, I tend to focus on how can we understand sexual violence in order to help someone who's recovering from it, and then how do we understand what sexual violence is to prevent it before it starts happening through bystander intervention. Now, the whole bystander intervention thing became popular, increasingly popular, I should say, roughly 10 years ago. And although there were some earlier efforts, Jackson Katz in particular talked about bystander intervention for about has been for about 20 years, and others, Latané and Darley in 1973 came out with the first article describing the bystander effect. So it's, or I'm sorry, it wasn't 73, I believe it was 68, 69, in that range. So at any rate, um, lots of people in the early years tended to talk about bystander intervention. It began to really pick up traction about 10 years ago. And I'll be honest, at first when I heard about bystander intervention, I thought it was kind of hokey. I thought it was kind of silly. I didn't think it would work. But my mind changed because one of the things that I've done with my work is consistently do outcomes assessment research on it, and then redesign an intervention, and then do more outcomes assessment research, and then redesign an intervention, that sort of thing. And I tried different things to move from being able to document attitude change to behavior change, and wasn't quite able to break that behavior change barrier until I added a component of bystander intervention to the workshop that I was presenting to men. That's what broke the behavior change barrier. And there's an article on that in your readings for this week, Foubert, Newberry, and Tatum, 2007. And so I became then much more a proponent of bystander intervention. And indeed, right now it is about the most common method that's emphasized in rape prevention education. And I think that's a good thing. There are lots of people who've done good work. When I talk about the ones that have the most effect on lasting attitude, lasting behavior change, I tend to mention four different people's work. Jackson Katz, who I mentioned briefly before, and there's an article he wrote in the readings myself, Victoria Banyard out of the University of New Hampshire, and then there's a newer approach that doesn't have as much research about it, but that's from Dorothy Edwards. She's out of the University of Kentucky, and so don't have any readings by her in your readings for the week because they're kind of more in the early stages of documenting their impact, but they do have some good data. So um, I there's also, I put an article in your readings about different approaches to risk reduction with women that are promising, and so I thought that was an important piece of the picture. But the primary piece, I think, when we talk about prevention is how do we most effectively talk to the individuals who might otherwise commit sexual violence, and how do we create communities and structures where people won't tolerate sexual violence, where they'll see something that could turn into a rape and they'll stop it to the best of their ability before it starts. And so you'll see a bit about that in the readings. I also put a whole bunch of other things in what I call other readings for you to consider. As you look at those, you might read a couple if you're interested in learning more. There's a great article by Victoria Banyard in 2007 that's in there that really describes the bystander model. I didn't require it, but I think it's a really fine piece of work, and there are other things in there as well that can help you dive into this topic more. But until we really figure out how to effectively prevent sexual violence, it's not going to go away. I mean, that's sort of a no-duh statement, I suppose. But I think we need to focus a great deal of our efforts in studying gender-based violence to figure out how do we point to prevention? How do we actually knock down those numbers? And that is just critically important. And I think a big part of that is understanding attitude and behavior change theory, designing interventions that will then that can be designed in light of theory and research on ending sexual violence, and then let's continue to assess their outcomes. And if they're not working, let's not use them. Let's not waste our time or money. If they are, let's make them better and figure out how to really go at this problem of ending gender-based violence, particularly men's sexual violence against women. So that's a little bit on prevention. I know that there'll be a lot to chew on in your readings this week, and I look forward to a lively and engaged discussion.